Petunias, they can be a superstar in the spring and summer gardens and even into the fall. But every so often we notice some issues with our beautiful plants, just like the one that I noticed a couple weeks ago when this one started to regress and eventually diminish its health. And I've also noticed some issues with some of my petunias that are in the landscape. So I thought today we would come through and really kind of analyze what I've been observing and kind of try to determine what could be going wrong. And it's so confusing because these two containers are literally 2 feet apart from each other. One has died, one is doing beautifully. So what is happening? I cannot wait to go through and look and see what's going on, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say in the end. Stick around. So this petunia, it failed, but yet over here and behind me, they're doing beautifully. Interestingly enough, they're pretty much in the same location, same containers, same drip irrigation schedule, same fertilizing schedule, and pretty much the same varieties. But yet this is happening. One failed and everyone else is doing great. You know, gardening has a way of keeping us humble, but I think the best way to attack a situation like this and really find out what's going on is to slow down, step back, and take a moment to really analyze what could be the culprit. So the first thing I started thinking about was not really the plant, but the location. This block wall right here really does radiate the heat, especially after a sunny day. So you have two things happening. You have the sun, if it's a really big heat wave, beating down, and then you have the block wall creating a lot of heat. And you know, the containers are relatively small, so they don't have a lot of room to protect the roots, although the terracotta pots are helpful in really insulating those pots and keeping them cool. But you know, I don't know, because you have all of these other plants, you know, 1 out of 8 dying. That's interesting. But if it was already weak, a heat wave plus the heat causing kind of like a oven effect from the wall here, you know, who knows? It could be a problem too. Now, a couple weeks ago, I trimmed all of these containers back because they were really leggy, and this one bounced back beautifully, just like all of the other ones. In fact, it looked very similar to this one. And so when it started to wilt, I thought, you know what, maybe it's a watering issue. So I came in here and checked the soil. It was moist. The drip irrigation seemed to be working correctly. So it wasn't that, but anytime we see our plants starting to wilt like this, you just kind of wonder, could it be water? That's usually what we think about when we see them start to wilt. But in this case, I think it's something else because it seems to be working fine, so we have to investigate further. Now that I've determined that it's not a watering issue, we have to look at the plant closer. So I'm going to take it off the wall and we're going to inspect it for further issues. So another thing that our petunias can have issues with, along with our superbells and other plants, is it can start to develop root rot. And if it starts to develop that, then what happens is the roots can no longer take up the moisture, causing the plant to essentially starve from feeding itself, or its circulatory system fails. It can also happen at the crown. A lot of the times you hear people say don't plant above the root ball, because if you do that, you can create or promote crown rot. I don't think that's the case here because I'm usually pretty careful about doing that. Also, these have been doing really well for a long period of time, even through a cutback. So I don't think it's necessarily crown rot, although you could inspect the area close to the crown. And if you start to see the branchings kind of, you know, disintegrate or fall apart, then that's a good sign that you could have crown rot. But I think we need to look further into what's happening by kind of removing this from the pot. Let's see what's happening here. And it looks like down at the bottom here, I have a lot of extra moisture, and it's very, very slimy. I mean, you can tell it had at one point a really good root system here, which is great, but it's looking like it's kind of rotting just a little bit. So I'm suspecting, and albeit this is still moist because it hasn't been taking up the moisture and the drip irrigation system has still been working, but I can kind of tell there's a little bit of slimy film here at the bottom, which it's kind of like things that are slowly decomposing. So I'm thinking maybe that perhaps could be the culprit, root rot. Man, it can take out our most treasured plants, and that's maybe what happened here. Now, before we go any further, I want to show you these petunias here in the landscape, and they're struggling for a completely different reason. If we look up close, you're going to see what I'm talking about. They look great from far away, but something else is happening down here. So these did not suddenly collapse like the container that I was just showing you. They've instead become gradually more woody through the middle while they're constantly blooming around the edges. That's a different symptom than just the one that we looked at. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is that not every petunia problem or every plant problem is the same. So we have to look further at what is happening. Now, a couple of weeks ago, these were having a major issue with aphids, and it was right about the time where we started having a little bit more intense heat and also humidity. And I think the load of the parasitic bugs that were on here, plus the beating sun and the humidity, really did take its toll, maybe contributing to that thatching that we're seeing here really up close. Now from far away, like from the distance where my camera is, it looks absolutely beautiful, but there's definitely something happening towards the center. And I've received a comment from a viewer a couple weeks ago talking about how it seems to be their petunias were kind of dying from the base and what could be the culprit. Many things could be the culprit. One of them being when your petunias are a little bit older, they naturally get woody from the center. These were just planted in early spring, so they're really not that old yet. So it has to be something else. So I just left these alone, and I wanted to conduct a little experiment because my petunias that I planted in the front planter were having the same issue. And at the time where I noticed it, they were actually worse. So I wanted to conduct a little experiment, and I treated the ones in the front. And I did not treat these here in the back. And then I eventually treated them, but I wanted to see how they would respond differently, and it was quite the difference. So the encouraging news is what I did worked here in the front. I started to notice that thatching. I noticed that it was starting to lose its leaves from the center. And when I lifted up the canopy and looked underneath, they were absolutely full of aphids. So I knew I had to take care of that. So I came through with a little bit of neem oil and sprayed underneath the area, and that took care of them beautifully. Interestingly enough, these had been kind of stalling with their growth, kind of like the ones in the backyard. They're still blooming, but they haven't really taken off and taken over that space in the way that these have since they've been treated. Once I eliminated that load of insects that were really basically sucking the plants of all of their nutrients, they started taking off like you would not believe. And actually 3 weeks later, they're fantastic. These are growing like they were intended to grow. These are Vista petunias, and they're doing beautiful. This is the cool jazzed paired with the cobalt blue superbena, and I couldn't be happier. There's nothing more frustrating than having a vision for something and having it decimated by either a pest or a critter. I know how that is. And so once I figured out what it was, it really did help these petunias. And they're mounding beautifully now. Their leaves look much more lush and vibrant, and I think they're going to be fine. So from now on, I'm going to be checking underneath to see if I'm having an issue. I was so concerned with budworms being a problem, not killing, but eating all of the blooms. I didn't even think to look underneath. So once I sprayed them, they came back beautifully. The ones in the backyard, they're still struggling a little bit because I let it go too long, and then I also want to conduct that experiment. So if you really want to know how aphids can cause problems, the difference between my back bed and my front bed really does illustrate that a lot. The good news is there's something that can be done about it, hopefully if you catch it early enough. Now, while it was great to figure out what was going on in the back planter and in the front planter and really conduct that experiment and find out that it was in fact aphids that was causing the problem, not two situations are the same, and it definitely doesn't explain why we lost the one plant on the wall over here. So that makes me think, you know what, it's probably something else besides that going on. And so I started to think, am I feeding these too much? Is my feeding schedule way too much for these plants? Am I promoting so much growth that these plants are having a hard time with their circulatory system when it gets really, really hot and humid? Are they able to sustain themselves throughout? Are they drying out too much because they have too much of a canopy to, deal with and sustain? And while I don't think that excessive fertilizer is a culprit in and of itself of root rot or crown rot. I do think it's something to think about as the plant is really trying to push growth. And when it's really hot and it's trying to grow and survive and bloom like it should, it might be something to think about. And also, our plants can age out eventually. We all have had a situation where we have one plant doing really well and the other plant just suddenly dies. You know, plants get old after a time. Not so much with perennials and shrubs and things like that, although they can. With annuals specifically, you know, they're supposed to last one season. Here in Southern California, they last more than one season. And these I just planted in November, and then I cut them back and they came back beautifully. So I have already given them the haircut that they need, and they're looking absolutely beautiful for the most part. So it's not that they're old, it's not that they're too leggy or woody. So I know that's not the case, but if they were a little bit older, that would be something to think about as well. Now, while I think perhaps root rot was the culprit, I don't think necessarily that was the single thing that led to me losing this plant. I think it was a bunch of smaller things that compounded over time, like the radiant heat from the wall. Maybe that was too much for this to handle. Or maybe it was the intense heat with the humidity also when it was already struggling. Maybe that was too much as well. I could have had a bug issue in here that I didn't know about. And I know at one point these did go dry because I had turned my system down a little bit. So maybe it went too dry and then it had a hard time recovering from the stress that I may have caused. And that's the thing. Gardening rarely gives us one simple answer. One of the things that I love about gardening is that it never stops teaching us, and some of our greatest lessons can come from the plants that we have huge success with, but also we can learn a lot from the plants that we struggle with. But either way, every season helps us become better gardeners because our gardens are always teaching us something along the way. Thank you guys so much for joining me today, and I can't wait to read the comments below on what you thought or think could have been happening with those plants today. Until next time, everybody, have a great day. Bye.